April 23rd, 1945, 14:20 hours, outside Bremen, Germany. Sergeant William Morrison of the East Yorkshire Regiment crouched behind rubble, watching the German defensive position through binoculars. His platoon had been advancing through the shattered suburb for 3 hours, encountering sporadic resistance that suggested Volkssturm militia rather than regular Wehrmacht. Now, they'd cornered what appeared to be the last holdouts, a group of Germans firing sporadically from a damaged schoolhouse. Morrison signaled his men forward. They moved tactically, covering each other, expecting the usual. A firefight, until the Germans either surrendered or died fighting. But when his lead section burst through the schoolhouse door, weapons ready, what they found stopped them completely. 12 German soldiers sat against the wall, hands raised, rifles discarded. But they weren't soldiers, they were boys. The oldest might have been 16. Several looked 13 or 14. They wore Wehrmacht uniforms several sizes too large, boots that didn't fit, and expressions of absolute terror. One boy was crying openly. Another whispered in broken English, "Bitter, please, don't shoot us." Morrison lowered his rifle slowly. His men did the same, their expressions shifting from combat alertness to something between shock and pity. These weren't enemy combatants. They were children who'd been handed guns and told to fight professional soldiers. The propaganda had warned them about British brutality, about torture and execution, about fates worse than death. Morrison holstered his pistol and spoke to his corporal. "Get them out of here. Hot tea, rations, medical check, and find a German speaker. We need to tell them they're safe." The boys stared in incomprehension as British soldiers helped them to their feet, offered cigarettes to those old enough to smoke, wrapped blankets around shivering shoulders. This wasn't execution. This wasn't torture. This was something the propaganda had never mentioned. British soldiers treating captured German children like lost boys who needed help rather than enemies who deserved death. The Volkssturm, the German Volkssturm, People's Storm, represented Nazi Germany's final desperate measure as defeat became inevitable. Created by Hitler's decree on September 25, 1944, the Volkssturm conscripted all males aged 16 to 60, not already in military service. In practice, as Germany's situation deteriorated, the age restrictions were ignored completely. Boys as young as 12 found themselves drafted, handed obsolete rifles or Panzerfausts, given minimal training and sent to defensive positions against professional Allied armies. The numbers documented desperation. Germany had mobilized over 6 million men into Volkssturm by spring 1945. Actual combat deployment reached approximately 1.5 million, including an estimated 100 to 150,000 teenagers between ages 12 and 17. Most received 1 to 2 weeks of training, sometimes only days. Equipment was whatever could be found: captured Soviet rifles, obsolete German weapons, Panzerfausts effective against tanks, but requiring suicidal approach distances. The indoctrination these children received had been systematic since childhood. Hitler Youth had taught military skills and Nazi ideology from age 10 onward. By the time boys were conscripted into Volkssturm, they'd spent years being conditioned to believe dying for the Führer was glorious, that retreat was cowardice, that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. They genuinely believed Allied soldiers, particularly British, would torture and execute prisoners. The reality of combat shattered these beliefs within hours. Volkssturm units were thrown against Allied forces with minimal support, inadequate weapons, and no realistic hope of success. They faced professional soldiers who'd fought across Europe for years, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. The casualties were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of teenagers killed in futile defensive actions that delayed Allied advances by hours or days at most. British forces advancing through northern Germany in April and May 1945 encountered these child soldiers repeatedly. The encounters created impossible moral dilemmas. Armed enemies were legitimate targets regardless of age. Shooting teenagers pointing weapons at you was justified self-defense. But the emotional reality was devastating. These were children, some young enough to be the British soldiers' sons or younger brothers, thrust into combat they couldn't possibly win. The first encounters. The initial British response to capturing child soldiers was improvised but consistent. Treat them humanely despite having every justification for harsher measures. When Morrison's platoon secured the 12 boys from the schoolhouse, they faced immediate practical questions. Standard procedure was sending prisoners to rear areas for processing. But these were children who'd been starving for days, wearing inadequate clothing in April cold, suffering from minor wounds and exhaustion. Sending them immediately to POW cages seemed wrong despite being technically correct. Morrison made decision that would be repeated thousands of times across British-occupied Germany. We'll feed them first, get them warm, medical attention for the injured ones, then send them back with next supply convoy. His men responded without hesitation, opening ration packs, brewing tea, finding blankets, treating scratches and bruises that would have been ignored for adult prisoners. The boys' reaction was complete confusion. They'd expected execution or torture. Instead, they received hot tea and British Army biscuits. A corporal who spoke German explained they were prisoners of war, would be treated according to Geneva Conventions, would receive food and shelter, would eventually be repatriated to families. The explanation seemed impossible. British soldiers being decent to German enemies contradicted every propaganda message they'd absorbed. Similar scenes repeated across British sectors. The Somerset Light Infantry captured 37 German teenagers defending a bridge near Minden. The Royal Scots captured 21 boys in a village north of Hanover. The Durham Light Infantry found an entire Volkssturm company, 83 men and boys, average age perhaps 15, who'd been abandoned by their officers and were starving in a forest. In each case, British response followed similar pattern. Immediate medical attention for wounded, food and water, reassurance through whatever German speakers were available that they wouldn't be harmed, treatment that acknowledged they were children caught in circumstances beyond their control rather than ideological enemies deserving harsh treatment. The psychology of capture. For German child soldiers, capture initiated profound psychological transformation. The propaganda had been explicit and terrifying. British soldiers would torture prisoners before execution. Surrender meant fates worse than death. Castration, blinding, prolonged suffering, designed to make examples of German prisoners. Better to die fighting or use your last bullet on yourself than face what the British would do. Many child soldiers had internalized these warnings completely. When capture became inevitable, some attempted suicide, putting rifle barrels in mouths, pulling pins on grenades. British soldiers often had to physically prevent these attempts, wresting weapons away from children trying to kill themselves because they believed death was preferable to British captivity. The reality of British treatment created immediate cognitive dissonance. Boys who'd been told British were monsters found themselves receiving food, medical care, and blankets. The disconnect was so profound that some initially believed it was elaborate deception, that kindness was temporary before real torture began. Only after hours or days did they accept that British treatment was genuine policy rather than cruel deception. 15-year-old Hans Weber, captured near Celle by the Royal Norfolk Regiment, later described his mental state during first days of captivity. I'd tried to shoot myself when we were surrounded. A British soldier knocked my rifle away and shouted at me in German, "Don't be stupid, boy." Then he gave me his canteen and made me drink. I couldn't process what was happening. They were supposed to torture us. Instead, this soldier, who looked like he could be my older brother, was keeping me from killing myself. Everything I'd believed about British cruelty collapsed in that moment. The psychological transformation continued during processing and initial captivity. British guards were firm, but not cruel. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. Violations resulted in disciplinary action. typically confinement or reduced privileges, but never physical abuse. The systematic fairness forced reconsideration of Nazi propaganda about British character. The POW camps. German child soldiers sent to British POW camps experienced treatment that further contradicted propaganda about Allied brutality. The camps held mixed populations: Wehrmacht veterans, SS prisoners, Luftwaffe personnel, and increasing numbers of Volkssturm members, including many teenagers. British camp administrators recognized that child prisoners required different handling than adults. Informal accommodations emerged: extra rations for growing boys, educational programs, separation of youngest prisoners from hardcore Nazis who might continue indoctrination. At Camp 186 near Nottingham, the commandant established separate barracks for prisoners under 16. The rationale was partly protective, preventing abuse by older prisoners, and partly practical. The boys needed education more than standard POW activities. British authorities arranged for teachers to provide basic instruction in mathematics, English, and practical skills that would help them survive in post-war Germany. The food was adequate to good, certainly better than most child soldiers had eaten during final months before capture. British POW rations provided approximately 2,900 calories daily, more than German military rations in early 1945. For boys who'd been starving during final weeks of war, the regular meals were almost overwhelming. Some ate too quickly and made themselves sick. Others carefully saved portions, unable to believe food would continue being available. Medical care was systematic and non-discriminatory. Camp infirmaries treated German prisoners, including children, with the same standards applied to British soldiers. Boys suffering from malnutrition received vitamin supplements and adjusted diets. Those with untreated combat wounds received surgery and rehabilitation. Mental health needs were addressed through camp chaplains and medical officers who recognized that child soldiers were dealing with trauma beyond normal POW experience. The recreational opportunities were extensive compared to what boys had experienced in Germany. Football matches became regular events, prisoners organizing teams, playing matches that drew crowds of spectators. British guards sometimes participated as referees or even players. The competition was genuine and fierce, but also reminded boys that normal life included activities beyond combat and survival. The work programs German prisoners assigned to agricultural work in Britain experienced interactions that furthered their transformation. Britain faced severe labor shortages with millions of men still in uniform overseas. German POWs provided essential agricultural workforce. Child prisoners were included in these work programs, though with accommodations for their age, shorter work hours, less physically demanding tasks, more supervision. 16-year-old Franz Dietrich was assigned to a farm in Yorkshire, working alongside British Land Army women and local farmers. The work was hard. Franz had been city boy before conscription, but fair. The farmer, Robert Harrison, had lost his son at Monte Cassino, but treated Franz decently, showing him how to perform tasks properly, expecting competent work, providing tea during breaks. Harrison's wife Margaret treated Franz almost maternally, ensuring he ate enough, mending his worn clothing, asking about his family in Germany. For Franz, who'd lost his mother to bombing, the kindness was overwhelming. He worked hard, partly from gratitude, partly from desire, to prove not all Germans were the monsters propaganda portrayed. These work relationships created opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Prisoners learned English through daily contact. British farmers learned fragments of German. Conversations started cautiously: weather, crops, work, then expanded to families, homes, hopes for peace. The human connections developed gradually but genuinely, breaking down propaganda stereotypes on both sides. Some British civilians initially objected to employing German prisoners, particularly younger ones, but most discovered that boys who worked diligently and behaved properly earned respect regardless of nationality. The shared labor created context for interaction that transcended political enmities. Farmers and prisoners working together toward common goals, finding similarities that war had obscured. The individual connections. Beyond institutional policies, individual British soldiers formed relationships with captured child soldiers that transcended the prisoner-captor dynamic. Corporal James Stevens of the Middlesex Regiment had lost his younger brother at Caen, killed by German defensive fire during Normandy campaign. When his unit captured a group of Volkssturm, including several 13- and 14-year-olds, Stevens struggled with complicated emotions. These boys served the regime that killed his brother, but they were also clearly victims, children who'd been given weapons and thrust into war they didn't create. Stevens found himself talking to one boy, Klaus Hartmann, 14, from Hamburg, whose father had been killed on the Eastern Front and whose mother had died during bombing. Klaus was essentially orphaned, with no home to return to when repatriation occurred. Stevens began spending time with Klaus during off-duty hours, teaching him English, explaining what life in Britain was like, offering perspective that Klaus's Nazi education had never provided. The relationship was informal and probably violated regulations about fraternization with prisoners. But officers looked the other way, recognizing that Stevens was processing grief through helping a boy who'd lost as much as Stevens had. When Klaus was eventually repatriated, Stevens gave him his own warm coat and a letter of reference that might help Klaus find work in destroyed Germany. Similar connections formed across British camps. Guards would bring extra rations for favorite prisoners, typically the youngest boys who reminded them of sons or younger brothers. Some guards brought books and magazines from home. Others taught practical skills, carpentry, mechanics, farming techniques that would help boys survive in post-war chaos. The connections often included emotional support that boys desperately needed. Many child soldiers were dealing with trauma from combat, grief from family losses, and psychological damage from years of indoctrination and violence. British soldiers who'd seen enough combat to understand trauma sometimes became informal counselors, listening to boys describe experiences they couldn't process alone. The Education Initiative British authorities recognized that child soldiers needed education as much as incarceration. Many had received minimal schooling after age 12, their education interrupted by Hitler Youth activities and eventual conscription. They lacked basic skills necessary for functioning in post-war Germany: mathematics, literacy, practical knowledge about civilian trades and professions. Returning them to destroyed Germany without education condemned them to poverty and limited opportunities. Camp 186 established formal education program for prisoners under 18. British teachers volunteered to teach English, mathematics, basic science, and practical skills. The classes were voluntary initially, but participation rates exceeded 90%. The boys recognized education as valuable resource being offered freely. The English language instruction was particularly valuable. Boys who learned English would have employment advantages in occupied Germany, where Allied administration required German speakers who understood English. The practical value motivated serious study. Boys who'd been indifferent students before the war became dedicated learners when they understood education's connection to post-war survival. Vocational training included carpentry, mechanics, farming, and basic construction skills. British tradesmen volunteered time teaching German prisoners skills that would help them rebuild destroyed cities. The training was hands-on and practical. Boys learned by doing rather than just theoretical instruction. Many discovered aptitudes they hadn't known they possessed. The educational initiative served multiple purposes. It kept prisoners productively occupied, reducing discipline problems that came from boredom. It prepared them for post-war life, increasing likelihood they'd become productive citizens rather than embittered veterans, and it demonstrated British values, that education and opportunity were offered even to defeated enemies, that Britain was fighting for principles that included helping rather than just punishing. The Christmas of 1945. December 1945 brought first Christmas of peace, though many German prisoners remained in British camps awaiting repatriation. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas celebrations, decorating barracks, organizing religious services, preparing special meals within rationing constraints. British guards contributed to celebrations, donating cigarettes, chocolates, and small gifts purchased with their own money. At Camp 186, the youngest prisoners, boys who'd been captured between ages 13 and 16, organized Christmas service in Camp Chapel. They sang traditional German carols, Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, voices filling the wooden building with music that transcended nationality and war. British guards standing watch outside stopped to listen, many remembering their own sons or younger brothers, wondering how any civilized nation could send children to fight and die. After the service, Camp Commandant made brief speech through interpreter. He acknowledged the boys had fought bravely, misguided perhaps, but courage deserved recognition. He noted that war was over, that they'd survived when many hadn't, that they should take pride in survival and use the opportunity to build better lives and better Germany. He concluded by wishing them peaceful Christmas and promising repatriation would proceed as quickly as logistics allowed. The meal was modest by peacetime standards, but impressive given rationing constraints. Turkey, children. They prevented suicides when boys tried to kill themselves rather than face expected torture. They provided food, shelter, medical care, education. They maintained civilized standards even when dealing with defeated enemies who'd fought for explicitly barbaric regime. That choice had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate humanitarian benefit. The boys who received mercy carried those memories throughout their lives. They taught their children and grandchildren that British forces had chosen humanity over hatred. They became advocates for democracy and reconciliation. They helped build post-war Germany into stable partner rather than embittered enemy nursing grievances. The field where British soldiers found 12 terrified boys expecting execution became symbol of something essential about how wars should end. Not with vengeance that perpetuates hatred, but with mercy that enables transformation. Not by punishing children for adults' crimes, but by giving them opportunities to build better lives and better nation. German child soldiers expected no mercy. British gave them something better: vegetables, bread, even small portions of pudding that British cooks had prepared specially. For boys who'd been starving 6 months earlier, the meal was almost overwhelming. Not just food, but the gesture it represented. British willingness to share scarce resources with former enemies during important holiday. Some boys wept quietly during the meal. Others laughed and talked with animation that had been absent during their first months of captivity. The atmosphere was simultaneously melancholy. They were far from homes that might no longer exist, and hopeful, recognizing they'd survived and had futures worth pursuing. The closing. The story of German child soldiers and British treatment is ultimately about choices made when cruelty would have been justified. British soldiers who captured terrified German teenagers could have responded harshly. These boys had fought for Nazi regime, had shot at British forces, represented enemy that had killed British soldiers and bombed British cities. Revenge would have been understandable. Rough treatment would have been legally permissible. No one would have criticized British forces for showing less mercy. But British chose differently. They saw children who'd been armed and indoctrinated, but were still fair treatment that acknowledged their humanity, education that prepared them for peace, and examples of civilization that propaganda had claimed didn't exist. Those gifts shaped thousands of lives and helped create post-war world where former enemies could become friends. That remains the story's lasting lesson, that mercy is strategic as well as moral, that treating defeated enemies decently creates better outcomes than revenge, and that maintaining humanity even in war's worst moments defines what civilization actually means.